Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Marie, and I'm a coordinator for the Earth program at journalismfund.eu. We work as a team with my colleague Claudia, who is here with us. Many of you have been in touch with her in the past as well. At journalismfund.eu, we are dedicated to advancing independent and investigative journalism across Europe that serves the public interest, furthers accountability, as well as transparency, and contributes to critical thinking and well-informed debate. In 2021, the organization launched the Earth program with the support of the Arcadia Fund, two grant programs for environmental journalism, one for cross-border teams of journalists and news outlets to investigate environmental affairs, and one for organizations to develop training and capacity building programs for environmental journalists. As part of the Earth program, journalismfund.eu is launching a series of trainings and webinars that will be accessible to the environmental journalism community. Today, we are kicking off our 5-year training program with the first webinar exploring the context of your environmental story. From looking into the global context to shaping your local environmental story, to linking your local story to the global climate change challenges. So we are pleased to welcome Stéphane Aurel and Mark Shapiro today. They will guide you through their insight and perspective on contextualizing your environmental story. Each speaker will have the floor for about 20 minutes, followed by a 10 minutes Q&A session. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat window. We will address them during the Q&A session. We would also like to inform you that at the end of the Q&A, we will share with you a QR code that will direct you to a survey, and we will send you the link via the chat too. This is not a mandatory, but it will help us to organize the following trainings and webinars to respond to your expectations. Before we start, we would also like to know from where you are. So right now, we are sharing a question on your screen, and you can tell us in which continent you're connecting from. You have about 10 seconds to click on the place you live in or where you are based. Thank you, Claudia, for the survey. I think everyone has answered. Maybe we can share the result. Okay, excellent. Thank you. So I see we have people from all over the place in the world. Almost all continents are represented. We're very happy for this. So now allow me to introduce you to the first speaker of this session. So we welcome Stéphane Aurel. Stéphane Aurel will start speaking today. Stéphane works as an investigative journalist for Le Monde. She specializes in corporate lobbying and harm, conflict of interest, and scientific disinformation. Her in-depth work on the EU regulation of endocrine disrupting chemicals was shortlisted for the Albert Londres Prize in 2016 and awarded the Louise Weiss Prize for European Journalism in 2017. Along with Stéphane Foucard, she co-authored the Monsanto Papers, obtaining the European Press Prize Investigative Reporting Award in 2018. She was also active in reporting for ICIJ's implants file investigation, latest collaborative work on pesticides, big tobacco, the Koch brother networks, and big alcohol, trying to improve the world as the margin of this cross-border investigation. So I can also say that Stéphane loves cheese, and she loves to emphasize on that. So we welcome Stéphane. You can go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie, for the kind of introduction. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here, especially for those who were in Mechelen at Data Harvest and whose heads must be already very, very full. And so let me just, I need to be able to share my screen. Claudia. So as Marie said, my home specialty is to monitor corporate harm on the environment and on public health. I can share my screen now. Is that okay? for you. Sorry, just a technicality because I can't see I can't see exactly my screen for whatever reason.
Yes, Stefan, it's perfect. We can see your
Okay.
presentation.
I can't see it, but so I will try. So this is my specialty, and today what I wanted to do is to explain to you the basics of how corporate influence tactics and lobbying lead to creating this harm, which has a huge cost for our societies, and that is very rarely taken into account in environmental reporting as a structural issue. Corporations who sell toxic products and goods which damage the environment typically use the same strategies to manufacture doubt on the dangers of their products and their long-term effects. Their goal is first to delay or derail political action, and second to skew, well, it's always in parallel, skew the debate by disseminating their propaganda in the public discussion. Corporate political activity, what is also called lobbying, is one of the main causes of serious harm to the environment. That is climate collapse of biodiversity, human health, and ultimately our democracies. And social sciences have come up with the concept of commercial determinants of health, which I think is very interesting. It means what private sector activities that affect people's health. This includes and is not, of course, limited to climate change, air pollution, chemicals, pesticides, processed food, plastic waste, etc. And those activities are linked to a never-ending list of diseases such as cancers, infertility, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, mental health issues, etc. And so maybe someday soon, the academic world should come up with a definition of commercial determinants of the environment. Something that is very often forgotten, I think, is that health is a human right. It's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25, and that says everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family. And yeah, I don't know what it's never really considered when journalists work on human rights. So I'm coming to this thing that we call the tobacco playbook. So you read all the time that the oil, soda, pesticides companies are using the tobacco playbook, and the expression is now used a little bit like a cliche of infamy. But what is exactly the tobacco playbook? To summarize, it's a big toolbox of influence tactics that were invented and sophisticated through the decades by the cigarette makers that we also called big tobacco. And so the little poster history of this manipulation started in a hotel, a luxury hotel in Manhattan in 1953, when the cigarette makers were confronted to the building up of evidence on the harms of cigarettes, and instead of telling the truth to their clients, they decided to lie and to manufacture doubt about the harm of their deadly products in order to delay or prevent regulations. And these tactics have led to the death of 100 million people in the 20th century. And I think it's important to always remember this figure. And if nothing is done, it's going to be 1 billion people who will die of tobacco in the next century. How do we know that? How do we know that's what the tobacco playbook is, and how do we know that they've been doing this? It's because at the end of the 90s, there were big litigation in the US where the state attorneys general sued the 4 largest companies to get the reimbursement of the health costs related to tobacco. It was concluded in 1998, but what is called the Master Settlement Agreement. And in addition to fines and financial compensation, the companies were asked to release their internal documents And there are now, so big trucks arrived to at the office of the big tobacco companies, and took card boxes to the University of California in San Francisco and started scanning the documents. And at that time, the OCR wasn't working well, but now it is. And there are 14 million documents that you can search in this database. And this is because, thanks to this whole, it's like entering the mind of the tobacco industry to go in those archives, that academics were able to understand what the tactics were. And what is important it's also to see that there was an intention, because in influence, there's always the problem of, it's always very difficult to demonstrate that there was an intention to influence. And in the tobacco papers, you could really see that. The most famous document in this bunch of archives is a 1969 document where they explicitly say that their product is to manufacture doubt. Doubt is our product. It's a very well-known document. So to summarize in big themes, what we can really call a corporate playbook instead of a tobacco playbook, is to fight against the what a scholar called the uncomfortable knowledge. This uncomfortable knowledge usually comes from public agencies or academic researchers in universities paid by public money, and that produce studies showing harmful effects of the products, which can be chemicals, pesticides, asbestos, physical agents too. And how they do that is the manufacturing of doubt is done through generating controversies, but they are pseudo controversies. They are not actual scientific controversies that are alive and existing in the competent scientific community. The way you do that when you're a company, it's to highlight the scientific uncertainty instead of the certainty or the evidence that there is already, to minimize the evidence that is coming from those independent scientists and agencies, and also to attack and undermine the reputation of scientists and organizations. And we've seen that from 2015 to 2017, when the UN International Agency for Research on Cancer classified glyphosate, this is Roundup #1 ingredient, as probably carcinogenic for humans. This is of course the famous glyphosate made by Monsanto, and Monsanto really waged a war against IARC to undermine the credibility of this classification that led to hundreds and thousands of litigations in the US. And so all these tactics that are under these three main points are derived from the tobacco matrix and can really be called, I think now, a corporate playbook. The corporations are really in this position of claiming they use science. There's a misuse of science and of the word science, and very often you can see this expression that they demand science-based policies, and they talk about sound science. But like David Michaels, who wrote a fantastic book about those tactics, says it only sounds like science. Based on those internal documents and also NGO and journalist work, some academics have made some taxonomies. I'm a very huge fan of these papers because it's a mix of investigative journalism and super nerdiness in academia, where they classified the tactics under several themes and umbrellas. The main ones, I think, that are that can be extremely useful to help an investigative journalist are Tesleg team on this science for profit model. So it's focused on the manipulation of science, and the policy dystopia model, both were produced by academics at the Bath University in the UK, who are the main specialists in tobacco tactics, is on the science, but also on the political aspect of influence. It's just to show you how it looks like. They have really tried to embrace any tactic they could encounter, and everything is documented. There are a wealth of examples that can be also useful for investigations that were never made. And I think if you ever want to work on this corporate tactics, or you encounter something that you think is a corporate tactic, you can use those taxonomies as kind of roadmaps to help you work. Now that, so my main point was about this manipulation of science, but there's also what the hardcore lobbying, the lobbying per se on decision makers. What are the targets of this lobbying? It's of course the governments, the EU Commission for Europe, politicians, members of the parliament, political parties in some countries like the US is well known for that. The funding, the direct funding of the parties by corporations is a major source of lobbying on politicians, but on those issues, because the products we're talking about are regulated products, tobacco, pesticides, chemicals. The main target are regulators, which can be specialized scientists in very technical agencies. The lobbies, it's always a word that is used for many things without being very much defined. So often I see that the lobbies is used like they are the goblins of the free market country, with no shape, no names, and it's not the case. The lobbies are, first of all, the companies that make the products, that are the leaders of the influence tactics, and they employ in-house lobbyists. So that can be anything, like Bayer, Exxon, DuPont. Second major actor of the lobbying are trade associations, who are the coordinators of this influence. So they group the interest of a given sector. The American Petroleum Institute, for example, in the US, was a leader in the dissemination of climate skepticism. CropLife is the pesticides trade association and has branches on all continents. The third type of lobbying actor are lobbying public relations and law firms who act more as advisors and openers, because they are contracted on specific missions, but their role is to have fluid relationships with regulators and people who are employed by government employees. Sorry, I was looking for the word in English. And the names of these companies are very easy to find and are well known. Then there's this fourth actor that is almost never mentioned in lobbying, which are the product defense firms, these are companies that employ scientists with degrees in epidemiology, statistics, toxicology, and these scientists are paid to produce scientific articles that will be published in scientific journals to counter the scientific evidence showing harm on the products. So they do what I call science washing. They produce this scientific, it's a lobbying material that goes through the science washing machine to be put on the desk of regulators. And then the last one is the big group of third parties, which are the voices of those corporate interests, but that are apparently not linked to the companies. Think tanks are very major actor of this influence on politicians, especially the US, where the foundations and the tax-exempt status of foundations and think tanks allow big corporations to channel lots of money in a very opaque way. scientific experts who can be experts who work in universities but can be paid for to be a consultant or to sign to write and sign a study for a company. There's nothing illegal in that, and something I should have said from the beginning, lobbying is legal. Then you've got this third example I wanted to mention is AstroTurf movements. AstroTurf movements are fake grassroots movements, and the word AstroTurf means a synthetic grass. So it's very, I like this this expression very much. And this strategy was typically invented by the tobacco industry together with the Koch brothers network, and this AstroTurf know-how led at some point to create the Tea Party. One concept that I think is important to understand when you work on these things is what is called regulatory capture. It's in the English-speaking world, everybody knows about this expression. In some countries, people don't never hear about it. In France, for example, we don't hear about regulatory capture. And it comes from an article of an economist in the 70s, George Stigler, who was a free market economist who designed, who pointed at the state like a potential threat for industry. And the idea of this regulatory capture, the core of this regulatory capture idea is to say that regulations should be made to benefit companies, and to do that, I'm sorry, the cat is having an attack right now. I'm trying to go back in the, sorry about that. So the idea of regulatory capture is that it's better to participate in the making of the regulation instead of being the victims of regulation later. That's a little icing on the cake on this. That's a leaked document from BASF, the #1 chemical company based in Germany. It's a slide explaining the company's strategy on the nanotechnology directive at the EU level. And what it says is the sooner the better. And it shows the different, the timeline of the decision process. And what is important is exactly the Stigler's theory of regulatory capture is to be there as soon as possible. It's a very basic advice, and this is also my conclusion is when after a while working on different sectors, I didn't decide to work on lobbying. I just realized someday all the tactics were similar, and realized there was a huge amount of academic research that can be read, like, I mean, sometimes like detective stories or investigations with interesting methodologies to be inspired from, and also lots of books. So I just show here I think the main ones, and then the #1 when you work on the environment, I think is the Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's Merchants of Doubt. And this was my reading list as a conclusion, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for this presentation. We are more than happy to welcome your questions. I currently do not see any question in the Q&A box at the bottom. Anybody would like to jump in? You can also drop your question in the chat box if you prefer.
While I'm throwing things at the cat.
If that's okay for everyone, then we can keep them. Oh, okay, I see. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Daiva. Oh, thank you, Pablo. So Stefan, we have a few questions coming your way. Okay, how do you find someone, an expert, for example, who can tell you that their evidence is fake? Is your first question, Stefan.
Well, usually it's a good question because there's this image that everything that I explained, it's not about creating fake data or fake scientific evidence. It's about creating data that can stand what is called the peer review in scientific journals. So it's not faked evidence. It happens that there is some fake scientific data, but it's not the point. The point is to have real figures or reanalysis, because for this product defense companies that I mentioned, they very rarely produce their own scientific studies. What they do is they take the data from others and they reanalyze it and reinterpret it differently to just throw it back as like a boomerang at the face of others. So the fake science is not really the main issue.
Thank you, Stefan.
Yes, I will just jump in for a few seconds. Stefan, could you please close the presentation?
Yes.
Thank you.
Like this, what do you want me to stop sharing my screen or?
Yes, indeed. Can you hand the host rights to Claudia? Thank you, Stefan.
Okay.
Sorry for the technicalities. And thank you for your answer, Stefan, on this.
But I'm not sure I know how to do this. I'm sorry, because we didn't do that earlier.
That's okay. While I let you deal with the IT, I will actually share with you another question, Stefan, from Pablo. When you are working on a new topic that you don't manage, how do you find your independent sources?
Sorry, my independent
sources.
Oh, well, I think it has become a little difficult for me to answer this. Is it okay, the screen sharing thing now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. Because for most sectors, I know where to find the experts. But usually, it's a very difficult one, because when you want to find an expert that doesn't have any conflict of interest, that requires quite an extensive investigation sometimes. And conflicts of interest are not always disclosed. So you can be mistaken on the independence of a scientist you contact. So the best thing is to identify if you can analyze the scientific literature to analyze and the experts who publish the most on a given topic. I mean, it could take 1 hour to explain how to identify an independent expert, but the first thing would be to check the competence of the person on a given topic. Like, for example, on the climate skepticism, the issue for a decade or two, the three main scientists who participated in disseminating doubt on the human origin of climate change were physicians that had no clue about climate science, and they were they were Cold War scientists who had absolutely no competence, but they were wrapped in the cloth of science, and using the authority of science to speak as if they were the guardians of science.
Thank you, Stefan. We have a couple of minutes for a few more questions. We have a question from Emmanuel. How can you verify that the materials used are true? And do you ask other experts to cross-check and verify?
Well, it depends. There's a great variety of material, but often disclosures or affiliations in scientific papers are enough to identify what's going on. For example, any product defense material, you would find a product defense company employee in the list of authors, for example. Or I'll take an example. When Monsanto organized their defense of glyphosate starting 2015, they created this glyphosate task force scientific panel that included independent researchers, and but the publications were disclosing that Monsanto commissioned the product defense company to set up this committee. So and what's important to something I didn't mention is we know that all science is not equal, and something that is called the funding effect has been demonstrated. The funding effect is that the source of funding of a given study on the product it has an impact on the results of the study. So you have between 4 and 8 more chances to have a positive result on the product if you are the manufacturer of this product. And this is something that has been demonstrated on a statistical from a statistical point of view on I think 8 different products now, or 9. So it should be a powerful tool to evaluate the independence of a scientific study or of a scientific expert.
Thank you, Stefan. Maybe one last question again. We have Rihab. Thank you for your question. Rihab is from the Global South and is asking, according to you and in your point of view, Stefan, how to better contextualize an environmental story in the Global South, I believe.
Well, I'm not a specialist of the Global South, so it would be hard for me to give, I think, a relevant answer. But maybe that would be something to do to research corporate tactics that are adapted, because each corporate tactics is adapted to the cultural, political environment. And surely there are some things that are done in the South that are innovative and that we haven't seen in the North Hemisphere.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Claudia. Sorry for the technicalities. We will move on to our next speaker, Mark Shapiro. Mark Shapiro is an award-winning journalist, investigative journalist specializing in the environment and the interplay between environmental health and political and economic power. His most recent book, Seeds of Resistance: The Fight to Save Our Food Supply, investigates the search for seeds capable of resilience to climate change and the struggle with agri-chemical companies to control them. Mark was formerly senior correspondent at the Center for Investigative Reporting, and he's also currently a lecturer at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. His work is also published in Harper's, Yale 360, Mother Jones, The Guardian, Inside Climate News, and Los Angeles Times, and elsewhere. So I will leave the floor to Mark. I wish you a great session. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you to the Journalism Fund for putting it all together. I love hearing Stefan's presentation since I've admired her work from afar for a while now, so it's been very cool. And nice to kind of see you all there. Abstractly, I know you're there, and it's great to see that you're there, and look forward to a spirited discussion afterwards. So let me start by sharing my screen. Hold on here. Okay, host disabled. Okay, let me try to do this. I think it's not working. I think I have to become a host. There we go. Let's try this again. There we go. Okay, so. See this damn thing. All my emails, which I'm sure are going to be fascinating. All right, so So let me ask you, if you look at this picture, where's the journalist in this picture? Oh, wait a minute. I hope the screen is not blocking. Hopefully the screen is not blocking the far right of this picture. Is it possible to move these screens? Anyway, this is a full picture, and the we may lose the punchline because on the right of the screen is the answer to the question. And I can't, Claudia, can you move this? I don't know whether people are seeing this. Anyway, there's 4 sheep here, and there's a black sheep over on the other side. A friend of mine's a photographer, and I always like using some of his photographs in my work. We, journalists, are the black sheep in any situation. We are the black sheep. The white sheep go off in one direction, and we try to figure out going off in the other direction to actually understand what is actually happening and what the actual story is beyond a story that everybody else seems to be following. So I happen to like this photo as a representation of journalism. So think of yourself as being in this picture, and we are all one of those little black sheep over there trying to figure out what the actual story is. I think as Marie mentioned, I focus on environmental journalism, and one of the key principles I've learned in the course of doing this, in other words, you have to understand what the environment is in order to report on it, and what are the underlying principles that govern ecological systems, that contribute to public health or the lack of public health. And in doing this work, I've actually come upon a term which actually comes from the realms of the natural sciences. Some of you maybe have a background in the natural sciences, and you might be familiar with this term. It's what scientists call the trophic cascade. And if you are a wildlife biologist, you will definitely know this term, because this is a term that biologists use to indicate what an ecosystem is and the various elements in an ecosystem and how they connect. And actually, they talk about it also in the context of, if you remove an element from an ecosystem, what are the consequences down the line? What are the cascading consequences down the line? And so I like to think of this term as applying to journalism. Journalists need to think like that. What are the cascading causes going backwards? We're trying to figure out, how did things happen? Unwind. In a sense, we have to re-engineer what's happening. We have to re-engineer the cascade to figure out what brought about a certain set of circumstances. And then we need to actually understand what the consequences of what it is we're writing about are in the future. So I think that this is a very kind of helpful concept when you talk about your reporting strategies and how to conceptualize your story. Marie and the foundation have asked me to talk about how to contextualize your story, how to move from the very specific to the broader picture, and that's what I'm going to try to do here. And I think number one is start thinking like that your story has embedded in it this cascade, trophic cascade, a good word to remember. Trust me, you're going to come upon 5 years from now, you're going to go, that word, that trophic cascade thing, I keep thinking about it. I hope, anyway. So the key questions that you're going to want to be asking yourself in terms of how you frame a story, in terms of going from the very specific, most stories start with some very specific situation, circumstance, and work their way outward. So if you want to try to contextualize it, I know there was a question earlier about this question of contextualization. Number one, a couple of things to keep in mind, because every story is different. As we know, every story is different, but I think there are certain things we can keep in mind as you approach the terrain you're working on. Number one, is the story you're telling representative of other similar instances? Are there other things that might be happening both in your particular region and other regions? And how can you link what it is that you're reporting on to the reporting of or to the circumstances in other situations. Are there similar causes and impacts in that place elsewhere? And try to begin to link those so you begin to contextualize your situation in a broader context. What are the downstream implications? Obviously, and I think that should be evident. What are the consequences of what it is you're writing about to those downstream of whatever event that is? And of course, what is the working away the other way, the upstream responsibility, the accountability? And the accountability is obviously key. I think it's what motivates a lot of us in this journalism and doing that reporting that will step by step identify those responsible, and whether their decision-making and policy-making may have consequences not only for your particular story, but for other similar kinds of stories. It's a way to conceptually think. And of course, the setting is the climatic disruptions to the whole scenario. You know, this is the era in which we're in which pretty much every environmental story will have some climatic element, and to understand what that element is extremely important. And there's a very good website, by the way, called World Weather Attribution, which I think is run out of King's College in London or Imperial College in London. And they really help to identify the particular contributions of climate change to a set of circumstances. So I would, to kind of hone this in, I think that actually environmental stories, one way to think about environmental stories is as a set. Environmental stories pass over, they're the most multidisciplinary stories you can find. They are stories that could appear in any section of a newspaper. They defy particularly stories about climate and things related to that. They're business stories, they're financial stories, they're international relations stories. I've kind of honed it down to 4 different categories, hopefully worth just kind of being aware of. I like to think of environmental stories at the very least, each of them has these components. It's science, it grounds everything, it grounds our understanding of the Earth. They're crime stories, and the crimes don't necessarily have to be illegal. As Stefan indicated, many of the activities we're talking about are perfectly legal, but it's the question of how we define crimes. There are questions of power, which is essentially questions of equity. Who gets affected by the degradations or the problems that we are focusing on? And most of the time, they are global. So I'll just go very quickly into each of these. Science stories are basically know your evidence. And I think you're going to be familiar with this. Got to know your evidence, and it's the science that provides us the understanding as to why what it is we're doing is important and what the effects of the, whether it's whatever it might be, whether it's the toxic pesticide poisonings to mining to water pollution, air pollution. It's all about knowing your evidence. And I would strongly suggest, if you're not already, getting acquainted with scientific journals and particularly understanding the implications that are embedded in the abstracts and in other in the journals, because there's great story ideas in scientific journals. There's actually great backup to the pieces you're trying to do, and there are key sources. They'll tell you a lot of the sources to who the scientists are that are working on stuff. 2 things I want to mention. I'm just going through this very quickly, but I'm going to give you 2 studies that I think are absolutely critical to doing substantive work in the climate realm, and from the climate realm rolls environmental journalism. The first is this amazing sequence of studies that are called Stationarity is Dead. That's a term that comes from this article which appeared in Science, and about, I'll give you a very quick capsule, but remember this because this is key when you're doing environmental journalism. This study that is a group of water scientists from different institutions around the world set about to actually study the hydrologic patterns in the atmosphere. And essentially what they determined was that as far back as they could count, they could measure in the atmosphere, atmospheric balance, over the last several hundred thousands of years, there was a fluctuating range of atmospheric moisture. And that fluctuating range in the science realm is called stationarity, and which presumes a sense of stationariness to the fluctuating, to the flows, which had a predictable quality. And what they found out was that about over the past 30 years, those patterns no longer apply. So the patterns of several 100,000 years of water flow no longer apply and you could essentially no longer predict the future based on the past. I mean, what a radical idea. If you're a scientist, you can no longer use past patterns to predict the future. What is that? That's like a bomb going off in the realms of people who design municipal water systems, who design sewage systems, who are hoping to farm and sustain themselves from the land, who are trying to build dams to supply electricity, a huge consequence. And what this tells us, essentially, and this is why it's key to keep in mind, is that the system, the ecological systems that we are in now are, we call it climate change. I think the term, and these guys suggest it, and I think an accurate way to call it would be climate volatility. It's actually volatility. It's actually the strange reshaping of patterns that lead to extreme events, that lead to water dropping intensely for one period and then not at all for longer periods, huge changes in the pattern. So climate volatility, very key. I will, by the way, I'm really racing through, but I will send you the links to these studies because I think they're kind of important to just have in mind. The second study I think is worth holding on to is this, because from this question of climate volatility, it's like, who the hell is responsible for all this? Because you get caught up in how did we get into this situation? This study by Richard Head, which came out in Climatic Change, a journal, a scientific, peer-reviewed scientific journal, he went and decided he would analyze the emissions by studying atmospheric gas levels and even reports going back into the 19th century. And he determined who the top 20 contributors to climate change are. Top 20 contributors to climate change are in the world. And so if you're wondering who is responsible for this disruptive conditions that we are in, you can actually go to this very handy study. And again, I'll send you the link. And he even does us the great favor of including a chart of the top 20 state-owned and privately owned corporations that are responsible for the bulk of greenhouse gases. And these 20 companies are responsible for 30% of all the greenhouse gases that have been emitted in the last 150 years. And of course, you'll see some of your favorite companies up here at the top: Chevron, which is located not far from where I live, ExxonMobil, Saudi Aramco, BP from the UK, and our dear friends at Gazprom in the Russian Federation are the top 5. So those are something to keep in mind. Again, I'll send those to you and there's a million studies. You're all working on different stories, so you have your own studies to refer to, but I just wanted to introduce these into your thinking because they provide kind of seminal information. Second thing, environmental stories are crime stories, basically, and it doesn't necessarily have to mean they're illegal. It just means that they may be crimes against the common resources of a community or of a region, maybe crimes that you, the journalist, can think of the way that people whose health is impacted by activity, by pollution and other factors. So I went to an Interpol conference a couple of years ago, and in Lyon, they're headquartered in Lyon. You know, Interpol is the International Police Agency, and they had a conference because they were announcing the founding of an environmental crime unit within Interpol. And what happened is they were getting police people loaned to the agency. You probably know Interpol works with all these different national police agencies. And I ran into a guy who was a homicide detective in The Hague, in the Netherlands, the Dutch. And I asked him, I said, what did you learn in being a homicide detective that you could apply to environmental crimes? And his response has just stayed with me all these years. He said, we are trying to prevent murder in the future. Murder in the future. I mean, that is what this profession is about in many ways. And it's not obviously it's not always murder like killing people, but it actually is about the degradation of health and the degradation of ecosystems that has the consequences of undermining the conditions for many people. So they are also crime stories, not necessarily illegal. They're power stories, follow the money to the source of power. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this process. Do what you can to actually determine who has the power in these situations. And critically, what is the equity component to this question? How are the harms distributed? And as you probably are aware of, but worth stressing over and over again, is essentially that the distribution of environmental harms are deeply inequitable. Those who are protected and those who are vulnerable to those harms. And that is part of the question of identifying where the power lies in the story. And finally, global. These are global stories. Many of them are global stories. Follow the evidence. Journalists have, and I think amazingly, and actually more and more are developing skills to follow these lines across national frontiers, because that's how money moves, that's how power moves. And needless to say, here we are at the journalismfund.eu, a great time to do possible collaborations with your fellow journalists in other locations who may be able to help you both to expand the view and the frame of your story, and possibly obtain information that you yourself might not have been able to obtain in your nation, in your own country. So I know this has been very handy to me to be able to obtain information from the European Union and other places that have data which are not available in the United States, and in reverse, data we can get here that people couldn't get in Colombia or other countries of people I've worked with. And the Global Investigative Journalism Network is something you should all be aware of, and I'm sure you are, but if not, GIJN.org, very important place for resources on global investigation. So I think I'm going to go into a specific story if I have a couple minutes here. And Marie, you can tell me. And because I want to tell you one quick story that I think might illustrate some of the points I'm trying to make. So I think I had a question. Was there a question here? Yeah, okay, no, okay. So let me just give you a quick example. I think that that climate and environmental stories often start very they start small. And when I mean small, I mean they start very specifically. It's not like they're small in significance, but I mean they're small in a place. That's how you write a story. You're all familiar with this. You start small and you want to work your way step by step by step outward. And that is what I want to just give you a little example and to offering the broader frame on something that may not seem to have it at first. And so let me tell you a story about a plant. I wrote a story, by the way, on seeds. I mean, I wrote a book on seeds. It's called Seeds of Resistance, and it's about the where the seeds are that we need to have climate resilience to all these dramatic shifts that are happening in growing conditions, and the fight to control them with some of these agrochemical companies that Stefan talked about, and has done some amazing reporting on. But I want to tell you a little story about how to go about, which I think is maybe an example, how to go from something very specific to something somewhat bigger. And that begins the story of a plant. And that is this plant, which is called, well, first I'll let you see this. This is a grass that grows in the Middle East. And it actually has a name. It's called Agapanthus tauchi. Which is a name I had no idea. I'd never heard this before in my life until I started talking to like a plant scientist. They started telling me about this amazing plant. This plant grows wild, essentially in the Middle East, in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. Why does this plant matter? Well, one of the reasons it matters is because one of the things that's happened as a result of domestication of agriculture is that a lot of the breeding of new varieties has excluded huge quantities of genetic material from what had been wildly diverse populations that were actually reduced dramatically by the 4 companies that dominate the seed business, and that is these companies. One is Bayer, which, as you now know, owns Monsanto, which, and for that, I tip my hat to Stefan again, because the investigation she did at Monsanto was groundbreaking. Corteva, which is owned by Dow and DuPont. Syngenta, which is down here. Syngenta is down here, owned by ChemChina. And BASF, which is a large German chemical company. Those 4 companies dominate more than 50% of all seed sales in the world. Now, why does that matter? What's the common thread between these 4 companies? Well, they are all basically chemical companies. So they're breeding seeds that are completely reliant on chemicals to survive. And guess what? They're their own chemicals. It's a brilliant business plan, a disastrous kind of public health consequence. So the reason these wild relatives are important, back to, first of all, crop diversity shrinking in the United States. I won't go into too much detail, but trust me, this chart tells us how crop diversity has shrunk, and which brings us back to this plant, which is a wild relative of wheat, which has grown up for thousands of years in hot, dry circumstances in the Middle East. Hot and dry, which is what many of the food growing areas are becoming. So I think I see a question, but I'll just keep going, Marie, until you tell me not to. This is a city. I'm going to now tell you the story of this plant. I wish I could see your hands, or because you probably recognize this city. There's a city in the middle of Iraq called Abu Ghraib. It became infamous during the US invasion of Iraq as a site of a prison where US soldiers abused hundreds of Iraqi citizens. Also in that city was a seed bank. And the seed bank It's located right here in Abu Ghraib. Why do you think there's a seed bank in Abu Ghraib, in this incredible city? Look at these two rivers. One river is called the Tigris. The other river is called the Euphrates. And guess what? There's Abu Ghraib right in the middle of those rivers. And what do those rivers tell us? That is the seat of agriculture. That's where many scientists believe that domesticated agriculture began. It's where varieties have grown up for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And so the seed bank in Abu Ghraib was extremely important because it held onto the seeds that have actually evolved in these Middle Eastern conditions, including Agapolis tauchi. So during the American invasion, which one could characterize as a crime, in 2003, that seed bank was blown up by bombs, and a bunch of scientists clambered together, raced over to the site, picked up whatever seeds they could, thousands of seeds from the floor, and raced them across the border here to Syria. And right here outside of Aleppo, right here, is a seed bank. That seed bank is about 30 kilometers from here in Tal Hajia, run by ICARDA, which is the UN seed authority, and it's called the International Center for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas. Why does dry areas matter? Nobody was paying attention to this place till about 25 years ago, when suddenly dry areas started spreading all across the world as a result of climatic stresses. So these seeds were raced across the border to Aleppo in 2003. They were protected in this seed bank until 2017, when the Assad regime began bombarding Aleppo horribly. And a bunch of scientists, again, raced those very same seeds right across the border into Lebanon, which is where they rest. They were met by this guy, Mohammed Amri, who's a Moroccan plant scientist and runs this operation. There's a bunch of Lebanese technicians who work and really have done a hell of a job in preserving a lot of these seeds. And the story does not end there, however. This is a scene of the seeds in the hothouse in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. For those of you who might have been there, it's an incredibly fertile, rich area of Lebanon. 2 minutes, okay. And I'll finish this story quickly. Soon enough, what happened? Well, those seeds ended up right here. This is a map of Kansas. Just to remind you, Kansas is a state in the United States, right smack in the center of the USA. And what's been happening is because it's been getting hotter, Kansas is the center of wheat growing in America. This is what's been happening in America, in the Midwest. The degree here of a 2-degree departure from what had previously been the average over the last 25 years has been 2 degrees hotter in Kansas. The result of that, just racing through, is this little creature called the Hessian fruit fly has now been able to hang out on wheat crops for longer than it ever has, because the winter is coming later, and been devastating the wheat crop across Kansas and the entire Midwest. Panic in the Midwest, panic in university institutions. University of Kansas did a study, and they planted dozens of different wheat varieties in a hothouse, and they let loose millions of these Hessian flies, and they wanted to see which ones would survive. And guess what survived? The Agapolis tauchi. This plant is the one that is now thought of as the way to save the American wheat crop. And now the final, that this thing is actually resistant to all these different diseases, Agapolis tauchi. They all have names like you're in a punk rock festival. Wheat rust, Hessian fruit fly, these are all things that they are resistant to without pesticides. They don't need pesticides. And now the question is, who is going to control that seed? Which brings us back to this. Syngenta has very strong presence in the Midwest, in Kansas in particular. The battle is underway right now as to who is going to control that, who is going to try to patent elements of that seed, and whether they can. They may not be able to. There may be Convention on Biological Diversity restrictions. It's very unclear. It's actually happening right now. So I don't have an answer for you, but I know that that little story of that little seed of that plant that grows wild in the Mideast is now of central interest to this huge chemical and agrochemical complex. So with that thought, I wanted just to illustrate how you start with something very small. You have, and you can get bigger and bigger and bigger. Just try to find a way to keep pursuing those reporting threads. And so all your stories are different. Find your story and follow that trail, and it'll all end up right in your hands.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thanks a lot. Could you please hand over the host rights to Claudia if you can?
Yeah.
And you can stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We would like to welcome questions to Mark, if you have any, from participants, and to Stefan as well. I think we can have an open discussion between the participants and Stefan and Mark. We do apologize that you are actually not appearing to the screen. This is one of our lessons learned for the next webinars and trainings. We would much rather have the format where we can see you guys and you can actually ask questions in person. But please don't hesitate to drop your question in the Dropbox, in the Q&A box. We will wait for you. All right. So I have a question for you, Mark. Thank you, Taiva. When you deal with these multinational companies, do you contact the head office or the local branch for the RTR?
Yeah, I think, first of all, they're definitely not the first ones I would contact. I mean, you want to really have your questions clear, and so and I'll answer Dragana's question in a second. But I think you want to have your questions very clear, and what you do once you understand what the issues are, and then you will approach them. I think you're probably it's a good question. I think you start with the local office because they'll be a little more plugged into whatever it is you are doing. They'll probably kick you into the corporate headquarters, but it's worth trying the local office, which may, if you're lucky, be a little less bureaucratized than the central headquarters, and they may be closer to the action. But first is not, don't go there first. don't go there thinking you're going to get some information. Find your information independently as much as you can, and then use that to extract more information. And you could even bluff a little bit, by the way. So you can even claim to know more than you do know in order to get them responding to perhaps a slight overstatement of the situation, can actually get them to respond in a way that they may not otherwise. Of course, don't use your overstated information, but use it as a way, as a point of leverage to get them to say, well, no, it's actually not that, it's this. Anyway, that's a long answer. Stefan might have a comment on that too.
I agree with the fact that you can manufacture doubt about how much you really know to
Right.
get some information. But it's recent. I mean, the past years, I've been learning a lot from. I've been working a lot in cross-border collaborations and learning a lot from other practices. And the right to reply approach towards the end of the investigation is not the same in all countries. It doesn't have the same importance in all countries. And I tend to go to the companies for their reply earlier than I used to. Like I was more last, we do it like this, us the French. We do like the last minute comment, you have like 24 hours, but I've seen that sometimes you can get actually useful information. You have like the old, like, language propaganda bits, but sometimes there are some actual figures that you can use, or actual information, or a correction on something you thought was right, but isn't.
And I know Dragana had a question about what happened with the seed bank in Lebanon after Aleppo. I mean, there was a lot of destruction in Aleppo, as you know. But I do believe that the seed bank is back up and running again now. It was out of commission for about 2 years. And now that the situation, it's almost painful to say, it's kind of somewhat stabilized in Syria, or at least that part of Syria. I think the seed bank is running again at a much more limited level. Not nearly as many international scientists used to go in and out of there, but it is, I think, back up and functioning.
Thank you, Stefan and Mark. Do we have any more questions from the participants? Please feel free to jump in and ask anything you would like. We also have a comment and question, indeed. So often the public-private contracts somehow evade transparency access laws. They quote competition rules. How would you handle such a case?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Sometimes, and obviously every country has different rules. Sometimes a public-private, first of all, the public part of the partnership, and I think when you mean, just to clarify, public could mean government, it could also mean publicly traded company. And if a publicly traded company, they'll have to actually submit some data. If it's the government, they'll have to submit some data. Private part of that is very difficult. You might think about going to the competition. Like, is there somebody who lost out on that contract that might be unhappy with the outcome, which would be one part of the picture. Maybe there were legal actions taken against the company that exist in some other form. Civil legal actions can be a great source of documentation in the court system, and you might want to check your legal records on either one of the players. So I think public-private does present some particular challenges, but I think there are ways around it, at least to get some sense of the picture. One, the competition; two, other legal actions, and possibly legal actions involving both the company or the CEO or the top people at the company who where financial documentation may have to be made public. I don't know, Stefan, if you've.
I wouldn't know. I would start from scratch on this. I never encountered this situation.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Stefan. I think, I see another question coming. Thank you for your answers coming from Karina. Participants, if you have more questions or would like to open any topic, this is the moment and the floor is yours. Otherwise, I may say that we may have reached the end of our session. I will just leave a moment.
Yeah, and maybe I wanted to thank you, Mark, for all your very kind words about my work, and to say that Mark's book on chemicals, which is called Exposed, is one of the first books that I read on the topic, because it was one of the only ones that was actually talking about the situation in Europe, and it's behind me there in the shelves. But something, I wanted maybe to build on from this question of what is legal or illegal. we're talking basically about crimes, but that are not qualified as crime in most laws, or to prove the crime is extremely difficult. And recently, with my dream team, we work on a family of chemicals, and my colleague Tim Neumus came across the concept of state facilitated corporate crime or harm. And I think this concept is very interesting, because companies don't act like they are in a vacuum. There are regulations, and the regulations are made by the state. And if the state fails to adopt those regulations that are supposed to protect the environment and people's health, then they are accomplices of the crimes that are perpetrated by corporations.
And they often go in and write the rules that they can say that they are obeying. So that's what's key. You write your own rules, and they say, see, we're following the rules.
Yes.
Certainly. And yeah.
Thank you both. If you don't have any more comments, and especially from you participants, I think it's time that we soon close this session. We would like to thank you for joining us today for this webinar, the first webinar of a long session. Before we sign off, we would like to remind you that you can get in touch with us at Journalism Fund at any moment if you are interested in the Earth Environmental Grant Program. If you want to know more, we can help you and give you some application advice and anything you need, any support you would need. Before we close off the session, I would like to share my screen and ask you to take your phones and scan the QR code that would appear in a second. If you can fill in a survey to support us to know more about the grant program, the webinar we just had, to support the following trainings that we will have. Your feedback is always welcome. So thank you very much, and have a great day, everyone.